performance standards are policies that actually require a minimum level of performance by buildings. And they apply to all buildings, even buildings that aren't holding building permits. So they complement building energy codes. They apply to the 98% of buildings that aren't being built each year, that may, if not for these laws, might do everything exactly this year as they had last year and 20 years ago. So they require that existing buildings have to improve on quantitative basis. So a building performance standard can require improvement on any metric, any performance metric that can be objectively quantified. And the ones that we see, there are 11 building performance standards in place around North America. And a lot of those deal with greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of them deal with energy use intensity. Some of them deal with Energy Star scores. They requiring that the buildings have to achieve some minimum level of performance by a set date, and the performance requirements ratchet up over time.
Hello, friends. Welcome to the Nexus Podcast. I'm your host, James Dice. Each week, I fire questions at the leaders of the smart buildings industry to try to figure out where we're headed and how we can get there faster without all the marketing fluff. I'm pushing my learning to the limit, and I'm so glad to have you here following along. Before we get started, here's a quick note from our sponsor. As we unpacked on one of our most popular episodes ever, episode 44 with the legendary John Petsy, SkySpark is a comprehensive software platform for connecting, storing, analyzing, and visualizing data from devices and equipment systems. SkySpark's automated analytics, KPIs, energy, and greenhouse gas apps turn your data into actionable intelligence, providing improved performance, reduced downtime, and operational savings. Head over to skyfoundry.com for insightful white papers, case studies, and blog posts, as well as a link to sign up for a free demo. This episode is a conversation with Cliff Majersik, Senior Advisor at the Institute for Market Transformation, a nonprofit that's focused on regulatory and non-regulatory ways to push the economy towards decarbonization. We talked about how market transformation works, the policy levers that we in the United States have for requiring decarbonization, and finally, we dove into how building performance standards work and what building owners can expect from those laws as they spread throughout the United States and the world. So without further ado, please enjoy this episode of the Nexus Podcast with Cliff Majersik. Hello, Cliff. Welcome to the Nexus Podcast. It's great to have you here. Can you start by introducing yourself?
Great to be here, James. Well, I'm Cliff Majersik. I'm a Senior Advisor to the Institute for Market Transformation, a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. that's focused on building performance as a way to fight climate change and benefit people regardless of where they live, work, and play. And I have been at IMT for more than 20 years now. I have worked with a variety of jurisdictions, variety of companies, from the early days when we were sort of narrowly focused on energy efficiency to today when we look much more broadly at building performance and how that plays into decarbonizing the economy and advancing equity across society. So it's been an interesting ride over the last 20 years, and I'm excited for what the next 20 years will bring.
Awesome. You might be surprised with this, but I would love for you to go back before those 20 years and talk about your personal background. Like, how'd you get into this space in general?
Sure. Well, I actually had a pretty wild ride getting here. I went to Williams College, focused on political economy. And my first job out of college was working for the New York District Attorney's Office, listening to wiretaps of mafiosa. My first boss was Elliot Spitzer, and I actually testified in grand jury against some Gambino bosses who ultimately had ended up feeling the consequences of the judicial system. So I've did that. I went on and ended up working on lobbying for improved Superfund toxic cleanup laws. I moved here to Washington, D.C. to do that, and went on to the Conservation International, where I focused on, well, actually before that I started an internet software company and sold out of it. It was venture backed. I went to Conservation International, where I focused on working with the e-commerce industry to try to reduce the impact on climate and biodiversity. Then I came over to IMT because I wanted to focus more on an area where I could really focus on the business case for improvements. And energy efficiency, which was the main focus at that time, there's a really strong business case. You can get a great return on investment from focusing there. So not only does it help society, but it helps the bottom line of the companies that are seeking it.
Got it. Brilliant. So I'd love to circle back on the software company. What kind of software did you guys build? And does the company still exist?
It still exists. At the time I was doing it, it was doing intranet software, helping companies to set up software to communicate internally in trade associations. We sold that off to a sort of high-flying software company. And then after I left, after I cashed out, it's now focused on secure instant messaging for the Department of Defense and other sort of clients that need secure instant messaging. But that was not the focus at the time that I was there.
Fascinating. Let's go into IMT. So Institute for Market Transformation, can you just talk about in general, what is market transformation and sort of how does it work?
Sure. Market transformation is a term that came out of the utility efficiency world. So it's set up in contrast to like rebate payments, the things that people most often think about when they think about utility, because those people will do the right thing when they're getting paid to do the right thing, but often they'll continue to do whatever they were doing before once those payments go away. Market transformation is different. It's permanently changing the business cycle. It's identifying ways to make things in someone's business interest to do the right thing, even when they're not getting paid to do so. So it includes things like laws that require improvement, but also ways that you can restructure the market with information. You can better align incentives such that business will change permanently, and there's it's not in any way at risk of backsliding if funding goes away. And so we were founded to focus on market transformation. Some of the things that we looked at are, for instance, the ways that property valuation didn't properly account for building performance. And by valuing a property better, by reflecting its true financials, the revenue stream that's going to result, the risk that's inherent in poor performing buildings, it just becomes a lot more profitable to invest in high performing buildings. And we worked with the Appraisal Institute and on federal legislation to try to better align the reality of building performance with how it's valued. And there's been some real progress there, and there's still a lot more room for improvement. But that's an example of market transformation that's in no way dependent on utility or other payments.
Totally. I wasn't planning on going into that, but can we talk about that for a second? How, in terms of where buildings are at, in terms of transactions, reselling buildings, how often is building performance being taken into account today? And is there like a roadmap that you guys have that kind of promotes that being part of the equation?
Well, at its most basic, certain parts of building performance are usually taken into account when you're talking about commercial buildings. There's a very different way of valuing a commercial building from, say, a single-family home.
Right.
And when you're thinking about appraisal, which doesn't exactly line up with the way that buyers and sellers think, but it does have some overlap. There's broadly sort of three ways to value a home or building. There's the sales comparison approach, where you just look at similar homes or buildings that sold and you figure out, all right, let's make adjustments to us comparable, and that's how much this one's worth. That's what people usually do in single family, and that often doesn't account for building performance pretty much at all, which is a real market barrier. And then there's the replacement cost approach. How much would it cost to sort of build this home or building again? That's the least used method. In the commercial space, the main method by far is the income approach to valuation.
Yeah.
And there you're looking at, what's the net operating income of that building? How much cash is it throwing off every year? And that will reflect things like utility bills. It will also reflect things like vacancy rates. And we know that high-performing buildings have lower utility bills. They also have lower vacancy rates, and they have higher effective rents. So that does tend to value building performance to a certain degree, but often what you have, unfortunately, is people that will be like, oh, well, this building has a really low vacancy rate, I'm just going to adjust that back to the mean. And now you've just eliminated all of the benefit of this high performing building. So it's important to understand, no, this building has a lower vacancy rate because it's a high performing building. And you need to talk to the tenants maybe to understand that it's more comfortable to be in, that they're reporting their greenhouse gas emissions to their shareholders and investors, and they want to be in a high performing building. But a lot of times, buyers, investors, appraisers don't take that extra step, and they end up sort of writing off the value that's been created by this high-performing building. So we've been trying to educate the market to recognize that high-performing buildings are better buildings. And tenants and others say, I have a high-performing company, I have high-performing employees. Why would I want to be in a high-performing building? And they're willing to pay higher rents and higher purchase prices for those buildings.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that little deep dive into that sort of side topic. But I'm sure there are tons of different topics that you guys produce education around that are just like that. Can you talk about a lot of this is resonated because that's the way sort of we at Nexus Labs sort of think about our role. How do we educate and help these long-term consistent market transformations happen? You guys are obviously doing it on a different scale. The way that I think about the smart buildings ecosystem, which again sort of overlaps with building performance or energy efficiency or decarbonization a little bit, is that there are a bunch of different roles and we're all showing up to create that market, which must transform, right? So how do you think about all the different roles of all the different players inside of each sort of market ecosystem? So there's obviously policymakers, utilities, building owners, technology providers, and startups. How do you think about all of those people coming together to sort of make transformation happen over the long term?
Well, that's exactly right. That's what we need. All of those players have important roles. And what we need is for every step of every major decision, building performance needs to be factored in. And policy needs to align. There are all kinds of externalities where, the most obvious one is carbon pollution. Currently in the United States, there's no cost to the polluter of putting carbon pollution into the atmosphere, and that's an enormous burden that is created for the world, including the U.S. And so policy needs to align incentives, address externalities, and then every person in the process, from the initial person at a tenant, say, who's writing the specs for what space we're going to lease. They need to write in that they want a high-performing building. Then the realtor who's showing them space where they can lease needs to be able to communicate to them and educate them about, okay, here is a high performance building, here's why it's high performance, here's how much lower the utilities will be, how much lower the greenhouse gas emissions if you're occupying this space. And then the lawyers who are going to be writing that lease need to understand that there's win-win opportunities, green leasing, where both the landlord and the tenant can come out ahead when they've aligned the incentives so that when the building is performing better, both of them prosper, and that needs to be written into the lease. Then the property manager needs to do a job of communicating that to the tenants, existing and new, and the building engineer needs to be operating the building for maximum efficiency, thinking about things like shifting load to off-peak times with lower carbon and lower prices. The utilities need to be pricing in so that they're rewarding building occupiers and owners that are using electricity when it's low carbon and when it's not straining the grid and risking blackouts. There needs to be either the engineer on site or an external expert that's coming in and systematically looking at individual buildings and portfolios of buildings and finding where the best return on investment opportunities for making those improvements. And that works in tandem with the utilities rewarding building owners for shifting load to off-peak times. You have to have investors that are thinking about what is the long-term value and risk of this building, and recognizing that high-performing buildings are lower risk buildings and deserve lower cap rates, which means higher value. And building owners that are smart enough to seize all these opportunities to improve building performance, to attract and retain the most valuable tenants, to draw investment from investors that are farsighted and they have sustainability commitments of their own, their ESG funds, or just increasingly in the future, all investment is going to be thinking about the risks inherent with long-lived assets like buildings and making sure that those buildings are future-proof, that they are going to be able to prosper in a decarbonizing economy. All of that comes together, and you have a huge engine for economic growth and climate benefit. But if any piece in that long chain is broken, and right now most of the pieces are broken,
A lot of pieces
then
are
the system
broken.
kind of breaks down, and people are dramatically underinvesting in high-performance buildings as a consequence of those barriers, of those breakdowns, lack of information flow, misalignment of incentives, externalities that have not been addressed. So there's a lot of things that need to be fixed, but the good news is that when we do fix them, it's going to unleash a wave of investment and really positive returns. And we need to see that. We need to see new millionaires and billionaires being created from fixing our buildings and decarbonizing our economy. Policymakers need to recognize that, and entrepreneurs and innovators need to be looking sort of 2 or 3 steps down the road and positioning themselves for as the new policies and the new market realities fall into place, and you get rewarded for these high performance buildings and these new technologies that are going to get us there.
Wow, that's such a great answer. We're gonna have to chop that up into its own little clip, like Cliff's mic drop moment about all the different problems that need to be solved. I love that. I love that answer too, because when I post about sort of what do we have to do, I like to post on LinkedIn and get a lot of feedback a lot about what do we got to do, what obstacles are there, what ideas do you have, what tactics do you have around decarbonizing buildings. And one of the things I get, there's a certain faction of the industry, a certain faction of this audience that's listening to this right now that would say, regulation is our only hope, right? The only way that we're going to decarbonize buildings is if someone says they must be decarbonized or else business no longer can continue, right? And I struggle with that a little bit because it doesn't take into account all the other, you listed out just like 20 different things right there, but it doesn't take into account all the other things that are not regulatory, right? You still need the supply chain. You still need the workforce to implement it. You still need, like you said, someone that's deep inside the specification process to make sure that this line item in the spec gets in there, right? So can you talk about it's regulation and I feel like is what I'm hearing you say.
That's exactly right. It's regulation and. We know that there has been improvement. Buildings are getting better. Information is flowing better. Incentives are getting a little bit more aligned. But when you look at the bottom line, when you look at greenhouse gas emissions across the economy or across our built environment, they're moving in the right direction, but not nearly fast enough. We need to do something very different. Expecting that we can just do as we have done in the past and get where we need to go is just unrealistic. We need a level of improvement across our entire economy that has rarely been seen in the built environment in any jurisdiction at any time. And yet we're going to need to consistently get that level of improvement every year. And so we have to pull pretty much every lever that's in front of us. And regulation is clearly one of them, but it's not enough. You can write the best law in the world, and the market needs to act on it. You need to have innovators that see the opportunities that regulation creates, opportunities for them to provide new services and products and to prosper. You need to have investors, brokers, appraisers, everybody else in the value chain needs to absorb this new reality that's created by the regulations and by just the evolving market, and look ahead and connect the dots and see, all right, this asset, which we used to think was sort of top of the line, it's impaired. It's not performing as well, and either it's going to have major improvements, or it's going to have to be completely repositioned, or it's just a much less valuable asset than we used to think it was. And this other asset, which maybe was neglected, it's a diamond in the rough, and it's much more valuable than we thought it was. And once that thinking pervades, then that's going to drive billions of dollars of investment. The New York City Building Performance Standard Law, Local Law 97, that's been projected to drive $20 billion of investment in buildings over a 10-year period. And that's just one city across the country. And there are going to be many, many people that will make a lot of money from owning better buildings and from providing the services and products to make buildings better. So regulation is a part of the picture, but it's just one piece of a big puzzle.
Totally. So now that we've sort of like set the context, I do kind of want to talk about regulation. And I think when you and I met at the Verge conference in San Jose in the fall, we had the idea. We were sitting it was kind of a serendipitous moment. It was like, I think we had met before, like a long time ago, and then we're sitting in this couch, and I think both of us were just like taking a break, and it was like, oh, I was like, you're Cliff, or whatever happened. I don't know exactly how it happened, but it was very serendipitous to have then the conversation we had around building performance standards, and it'd be fun to talk about kind of where things are going. So before we get into building performance standards, I'd love to talk about kind of all the policy, you call them levers, all the different policy levers that we have to sort of push the market towards decarbonization. So I'm going to kind of walk us through the different ways. And I'll give you a chance to add to them. But the first one is on energy codes. And I want to start with a little like aside for people that don't understand kind of where energy codes fit. Can you talk about first why energy codes matter, and then get into like the status of the energy codes and kind of where we need to go? Is it good news right now, bad news, where we need to head? But first, start off for people that like don't know why energy codes matter. Can you talk a little bit about that first?
So energy codes are one aspect of building codes. In most jurisdictions around the country, there are building codes which establish sort of minimum standards for any new construction, major renovations, and certain other improvements in buildings. And those become, unfortunately, kind of the standard construction recipe. I say unfortunately because building codes establish the minimum performance that's permitted under law. And unfortunately, a lot of builders treat that as both the minimum and the maximum. They're just building to the code. And energy codes are codes that were originally established more than 30 years ago to protect the occupants of buildings, mostly from high utility bills. If you have a really badly built building, you're going to have to pay a whole lot of money in electricity and often gas, and that doesn't serve anybody. And people that are buying a home or even buying a commercial building, they shouldn't have to be engineers and experts on building performance. They should have protection from the law, just like we have other consumer protections. A car shouldn't blow up when you drive it off the lot. Well, nor should a building be leaking massive amounts of air and driving up huge utility bills and being uncomfortable. So energy codes, which are building energy codes, were developed to protect buyers of buildings and make sure that they had buildings that function properly, that wouldn't be excessively expensive for them to operate. And then more recently, we recognize that buildings are a huge driver of greenhouse gas emissions. Buildings account for more than a third of all greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And that's, along with transportation, those are the two largest sectors driving our greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's a recognition that building energy codes are an important lever for improving our climate performance of our buildings and our economy. And that means that there's been a real push to have building energy codes, pushing buildings to perform better, pushing towards net zero carbon buildings, which means in part using no fossil fuels on site, minimizing the amount of electricity that you're using as well, and also in the future, and in most cases building codes aren't doing this yet, but they are starting to do this in California, pushing towards, when they are using electricity when there's lots of low carbon electricity available. So building codes are incredibly important for decarbonizing the built environment, but they only apply to buildings that are newly built, major renovations, and certain other changes that require building permits. And what that leaves, you're only adding 1-2% to your building stock every year. That leaves the other 98% of buildings that aren't pulling building permits that year. And that means that we need to have policies that address those, and we refer to those as existing buildings. And that's where the real big money is in terms of opportunities for improvement to those buildings. When you have 98% of buildings that are not addressed by building codes, that's 98% of the opportunity in many ways that is available for industry if you can drive improvement in those existing buildings.
Yeah. But for those 1 to 2%, it's kind of the best time to make it happen, right? Because a lot of times when a building gets built, you're not, the developer or the new owner after it's developed is not planning on doing a whole lot of upgrades for a while.
That's right. And in fact, the best time is at the very beginning. The best time to think about building performance is before you've even thought about who you're going to hire to design the building. A best practice is to set really high standards. We want a really high performing building, and we're going to put that out into the RFP or anything else that you're using to select the design team. And you're only going to get design teams that know how to build high performance, because some design teams don't know how to build high performance buildings. And then they're going to charge a huge premium because it's going to be change orders and trying to teach themselves as they go. But if you set the goals at an aspirational level from the beginning, often you can get very high performance buildings at little or no additional cost.
Got it. So last thing on energy codes, how do you guys look at like the current status of energy codes as IMT? Like, is there still a ton of work to do there, or is it kind of on its way?
There's still a ton of work to do. We have model energy codes that are developed by the International Code Council and ASHRAE, and those model codes are making good progress. They have a long way to go still, and increasingly you have jurisdictions that are pushing to go beyond the best model codes. But where the big opportunities are is lots of jurisdictions that are using 10, 12-year-old model codes. And those jurisdictions are leaving a lot of money on the table with low-performing buildings that are being built in compliance with the code. So they need to improve their codes, and also you have a big problem with poor enforcement and compliance with energy codes.
Right.
So those are the biggest opportunities are in raising the floor, the jurisdictions that have poor building codes, or in rare cases no building codes at all, and having better enforcement and compliance with those codes.
Got it. Okay, next topic is around electrification, which is similar, right? A lot of codes are requiring, and you tell me if it's similar, I guess, but my understanding is a lot of codes around the country, municipalities close to me in Denver, requiring electrification in new buildings or major renovations, retrofits. Where is that at, and kind of what's the roadmap that we need to go on there?
Well, ultimately, we would like to see all new construction be all electric, and there are a handful of uses that may take a few years to make all electric in the near term, things like backup power for hospitals and that sort of thing. But you do see several jurisdictions, including places like Denver and New York City, Washington State, that through their building codes, California, are saying, look, new construction is going to have to be all electric. And a little bit more difficult is major renovations, but many of those jurisdictions also are requiring that major renovations, usually with a little bit of a lag, also are going to have to be all electric. And that's certainly key, but again, that leaves out 98% of buildings that have already been built.
Totally. Let's pause here for one more quick word from our sponsor, and then we'll get back to the show. As we covered in our recent blog series on the 5 vital roles, smart buildings require engineers, and engineering that allows OT and IT systems to seamlessly and securely integrate with each other and integrate with common platforms. Creating a successful building intelligence strategy entails translating the owner's goals to outcomes, use cases, intelligent building technologies, and enhanced MEP systems. To learn about what JB&B is calling MEP 3.0 and the value of building intelligence design, check out our friends at JB&B and specifically their podcast conversation with WiredScore at the link in the show notes. Okay, I guess we're going to move on then outside of that 1 to 2% new buildings, talk about existing buildings. And maybe you could tell me what the difference between these two categories, but the next two categories I had would be benchmarking and performance standards. And some municipalities have them, or states, countries even have them as like one program, right? So can you talk about those as sort of a category in and of themselves?
Sure. So benchmarking and transparency laws are pretty new. Australia was perhaps the first. Australia and Denmark, I think, were two of the first places to adopt them back, 20-ish years ago.
And we did a
And
episode about a year ago with the Neighbors program, sort of talking about the transformation that's happened there.
Yeah, Neighbors is the Australian program, and it's been enormously successful. And it was one of the models. I helped write the first benchmarking and transparency law here in the United States in Washington, D.C., which passed back in 2008. And we were looking at Denmark and Australia as models for how to do that. And then in rapid succession, other jurisdictions followed Washington, D.C.'s lead. And in fact, New York passed its law after D.C., but it ended up implementing its law before D.C.'s was implemented. And so New York was also very much of a trailblazer. And now you have 40 some jurisdictions around the country, including states like California and Washington and Colorado and Maryland and New Jersey, that have these benchmarking and transparency laws. And what these laws say is that buildings have to rate how well they perform using the Energy Star system, which is the American system run by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. And it's a free tool that's been widely used on a voluntary basis going back to the late 1990s. And it compares buildings to their peers, and it adjusts for things like weather and also how many people are in the building, what are the operating hours of the building. So it's really giving you an apples to apples comparison of buildings against themselves over time and against their peers. And it gives buildings a 1 to 100 score, where 100 is best and 1 is worst. It also measures things like greenhouse gas emissions and energy use intensity. So these benchmarking and transparency laws require that buildings have to use that free system. They have to generate that 1 to 100 score and some other information like greenhouse gas emissions usually, and publish that for the world to see. So in all of these jurisdictions, you can go see a map of all the buildings in the jurisdiction. I should say most of them. Occasionally there are some where you have to sort of download a spreadsheet of addresses and scores. But you get to see how these buildings are performing. Is this a great building, a 99 building, or a really poor performing building, a 2 or a 3, for instance? And that is informing the market, so that if you're going to lease in a building, if you're going to invest in a building, you have a virtuous cycle of competition where you want higher performing buildings, you're willing to pay more for a higher performing building, and that gives the building owner an incentive to invest to make that building better so they can attract and retain tenants so that they can get that investment. So that's benchmarking and transparency laws. The first one, as I said, was in DC in 2008, and they've been steadily growing with more and more jurisdictions adopting them. But they don't require performance. They require disclosure of performance. But you could disclose that you have an Energy Star score of 1, the worst score possible, and that's it. You've complied with the law. And they produced improvements. Many sort of studies found sort of 2.5% per year reduction in energy use when you have these benchmarking and transparency laws in place. But that's not enough. That's not on the pace that we need to meet the decarbonization goals. Many jurisdictions have goals around like 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, net zero by 2050, and nothing that they had done, including these laws, had put them on pace to achieve those kinds of commitments. And so they needed something stronger that would accelerate the rate of improvement. And that led jurisdictions, again starting with Washington, D.C. in 2018, to adopt building performance standards, which not only, they're built on top of these benchmarking and transparency laws, they use the Energy Star program to measure how well buildings are performing, but they also set minimum performance requirements with consequences for not achieving those minimum levels of performance.
Totally. And you said 40 state and local governments-ish are now on board with that higher level of stringency. Is that kind of where we're at today?
More than 40 jurisdictions have these benchmarking and transparency laws. Collectively, it's well over 11 billion square feet of space. So it's a real significant part of the economy, and it also tends to correlate with some of the highest real estate values. Places like Austin, Texas, and California, and New York, and Washington, and Denver, and Chicago, Maryland. So you have a lot of high-value real estate areas that have these laws, as well as places that are Kansas City, which is a great market, but there's some more value to be had there.
Yeah, we hosted a Nexus happy hour in St. Louis last week, and we had the city's benchmarking performance administrator, Malachi. He was at the happy hour. So shout out to the St. Louis folks. Cool. So those are the kind of the four: energy codes, electrification, benchmarking, performance standards that I kind of have always thought are, the key to this, right? What other ones, what other categories are important in terms of policy levers that we should touch on before we kind of zoom into performance standard?
Sure. Well, we talk broadly about building performance policies, and that includes everything from the most common and perhaps the lightest touch of benchmarking and transparency laws, all the way through the most powerful of building performance standards. But in between, you have things like audit requirements and building retuning requirements, where you're requiring periodic energy audits to identify opportunities to improve the performance of the building. And typically, you are exempting from that requirement very high-performing buildings. And similarly, retuning laws, where you're looking at, the highest performing buildings are exempt, but other buildings have to bring in engineers periodically, like a 5-year basis, to look at opportunities to improve the performance of the building. And that's not about capital improvements, that's about making sure that the systems are operating as designed. And unfortunately, very often, buildings are not operating as designed, and so you can get a really good return on investment from retuning. And so those are a couple of policies. There's also building labeling. New York City and Chicago have these laws, and that actually involves requiring buildings to display in their lobby a letter grade, or in the case of Chicago, a number of stars, with 4 stars being the best, which actually lines up with the Chicago flag. And that's a more powerful message to the market, so that anybody walking through that lobby, including tenants, is immediately sort of alerted to the performance of the building, similar to letter grades for restaurants, sanitation, that places like New York City have had in place for a long time, and do drive behavior. I mean, you see, if I see a restaurant that has a C grade, I'm usually going to keep on walking. I'm going to look for a restaurant with an A grade. And similarly, the hope is that, and I think we're seeing some early indications that tenants and others will similarly want high-performing buildings. When they see it right there in the lobby, they'll ask questions of the owner, and that will prompt the owner to make improvements.
Totally. How about things like, I know a big piece of even enabling a benchmarking program is getting access to the data itself. Is there any legislation around simply forcing the utility to share data in a meaningful, accessible way?
Yes, there is. It's certainly a best practice, and we have a number of jurisdictions that have done that, either through legislation or through action by the regulator of the utility, which is usually called the Public Utility Commission or Public Service Commission, requiring the utilities to do that, and rewarding them for doing that. And then you have a number of utilities that have done this voluntarily. Sometimes they did it because they were required to do it in one jurisdiction, and they said, you know what, we're just going to do this across our entire territory, which may span several states. And so there is a map that the US EPA maintains, where you can see all of the utilities that will provide whole building data access to building owners. And this is much more of an issue in tenanted buildings, where the tenants are receiving utility bills directly from the utility, and the building owner doesn't see those bills at all. Because in order to Energy Star benchmark a building, you need to know how much building is being used across the entire building, including the tenant spaces. And that means that you need to put data from all of the utility meters in that building into the Energy Star system. And so it's easy if you own the building and there's only one meter, and then you just take the data from that meter, you take the data from your utility bills, and you put it in on a monthly basis. But if you need to get the data from your tenants, that can be a chore, especially in apartment buildings where you can have 100 tenants, and it's just impractical to try and get data from all of them. So in that context, having a utility that will take all the data together for all of the occupants and tenants in that building, and upload it directly into the Energy Star system, that's a huge benefit. It makes it much more practical for building owners to know how they're performing so that they can look across their portfolio and see opportunities for good investments, and also so they can comply with these benchmarking laws and other laws that look at building performance.
Totally. But you're saying there are like actual policies, kind of like
There are laws.
there are laws.
Frequently,
Okay.
a jurisdiction, at the same time that they pass a benchmarking law, will require the
It'll,
utilities
okay.
to provide the data.
Nice.
One of the challenges is that a lot of these benchmarking laws have been passed at the local level, but utilities are usually regulated at the state level. So that's one of the reasons that why we're particularly eager to work at the state level, because the states regulate the utilities, and it's very easy for them to require utilities to provide this data.
Kind of bridge
And then
that
there's
gap.
also requirements around providing real-time data, and this data is very valuable for like solar installers when they're making the business case to owners about why they should invest in solar panels on their roof, say. And so there are a lot of use cases for this data. This data belongs to the ratepayers. It's the people that are paying for the utility service that own that data. But sometimes utilities treat it as like, no, we want to keep this in a black box and monetize it and not make it easy for the owner to share with anybody else. So liberating this data and enabling it to drive transformation in the buildings and in the market is a big part of our strategy. And we've had some success there.
Great. Last question is around leasing. Are you able to actually sort of work the green? You guys do a lot of work in green leasing. Are you able to work those pieces into these different laws?
Typically, leasing is something that isn't really regulated. Governments, of course, lead by example with their own leases. So we have a lot of governments, including the federal government, that have green leases where they're saying, we want X, Y, and Z in the lease so that the landlord and the tenant are going to be both performing better when the building is a high performance building. But we have not seen jurisdictions that have said when you have two private parties, a landlord and tenant, that are signing a lease, that they need to have a green lease that's going to align their incentives. But what we are seeing is things like building performance standards, which have real consequences for non-performance. And if they're designed properly, those consequences will flow to the people that are driving low performance in buildings. And that's not just the owner, the tenants play an important role, especially commercial tenants. So you want to have, and we have a model building performance standard law, which aligns incentives. So both the tenants and the landlords have skin in the game. So they'll want to set performance targets. All right, this building is required to perform this well. Let's develop a plan for how that building will perform this well, and then let's allocate responsibilities. And the owner, of course, is going to be the leader in doing that. The owner is going to be making improvements to the buildings. But the tenants, through their own behavior and through providing access to their spaces and through potentially helping to finance improvements to the building, they are going to be an important part of the solution as well. And everybody needs to be incented to work together to have high-performing buildings. So while these building performance standards, if they're designed properly, they align incentives between the landlord and the tenant, but they don't directly require anything in the lease. But it creates a win-win opportunity. Even without that, there's a win-win, but it creates an even bigger win-win for landlords and tenants to sign these green leases that help them work together and to have really good communication.
Makes a ton of sense. So let's zoom in on building performance standards itself a little bit. So we started to a little bit there. Can you talk about, we talked about, 40 plus jurisdictions. If I'm a building like a portfolio owner and I got buildings everywhere and I'm not quite sure how this is going to impact me, what would you say to them to help them understand where this is headed in the future?
Well, what I would say is buildings are, one of the top two drivers of greenhouse gas emissions. You have jurisdictions around the country that have committed to decarbonize their economy, and buildings have to be a foundational part of that. So the buildings are going to have to perform better, and the jurisdictions are going to push to make that happen, and building owners need to be part of that solution, and they need to be working to make sure that these policies recognize real estate realities, and these policies are going to happen. You already have them in 11 jurisdictions around North America, including some of the biggest jurisdictions like New York City, Boston, Washington, D.C., the states of Colorado, and Washington State and Maryland. So they're already in place in lots of places. You have also President Biden has a building performance standard coalition, which he announced back in January 2021. January 2022. And that includes 37 jurisdictions, including other big ones like California, that are all committing to either they already have building performance standards in place or they're committing to have them in place by Earth Day of 2024. And so you can look at that map, which is nationalbpscoalition.org, and see all those jurisdictions. But even if you own buildings that aren't in any of those jurisdictions, this is the direction the market is going. This is the direction governments are going. So you need to plan, you need to future-proof your buildings by planning to have these policies in place everywhere. So adapt, and it's, companies typically have a single policy in place across the board, across their portfolio. So companies need to govern their portfolio as though there's building performance standards everywhere, and be pushing their buildings towards high performance, develop long-term capital improvement plans for all of your buildings to be decarbonizing over the next 15, 20 plus years. And you'll be rewarded. Increasingly, you're going to have these policies in place, but you're also just having investors that are recognizing that high performance buildings are a better opportunity, a better business opportunity. They're willing to have lower capitalization rates, pay higher prices for these buildings. You have tenants that want these buildings. So, design your corporate policies in the expectation that these building performance standards are going to be everywhere across the country, and know that even if they take longer in some jurisdictions than others to materialize, you're still positioning yourself for the future and to profit.
Totally. And this is something the capital plan piece is something I've talked about on the show quite a bit. And I've been pleasantly surprised with the progress lately in terms of hearing a lot of building owners talk about, okay, here are our exact plans. We couldn't say that like a year ago, really. It was mostly like, we have this target and we know these standards are happening and we know that we're going to have to improve, but we don't exactly know how we're going to get there. And I've seen quite a few leading organizations, especially at Greenbuild this past fall, a couple different building owner organizations saying like, these are the retrofits we're doing them, and these are the order we're doing them in. And like, it was very impressive to hear some of these presentations. So I feel like I want to like give a little PSA around just some hope there that that's happening more and more, which is great to hear. I'm sure you're seeing something similar.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, which isn't to say that there aren't lots of jurisdictions, lots of building owners that are still, their capital plan this year looks a lot like their capital plan last year and 5
Yeah.
years ago. But increasingly, the leaders, the ones that are best managed, are planning for the future and planning for a decarbonizing future. And you see investors recognize that. It's really hard to assess the quality of management. And some investors are using the sustainability performance of real estate owners as a heuristic for the quality of management, because that's actually measurable. You can see what the average Energy Star score across the portfolio is, what kind of capital plans they have. Their capital plans recognize the building performance standards that are already in place and their plans. And if you see a management team that's doing a good job on that, that's a good indication that they're doing a good job on other things as well that are maybe less measurable. And so we see the top management teams are increasingly building this into their capital plans and really leaning forward.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been wondering about, and you're the perfect person to ask, is that with New York going first and then other cities kind of following behind, what lessons have been learned in these kind of leading cities that are going to be then implemented in a rollout in the future cities? Do you have any stories, any examples from these leading cities?
Sure. Well, and we have more experience with the benchmarking and transparency laws that have been around longer. One interesting story is from Chicago, where they have a regular cycle. All of these benchmarking and transparency laws are on an annual cycle. Buildings have to benchmark annually and submit it annually, and then those buildings that didn't submit get reminders and potentially have to pay penalties if they don't. And that drives investment in building performance. And what we heard in Chicago was the building owner, the contractors, the engineering firms, the firms that are doing energy audits, the firms that are manufacturing better lighting and other products to make buildings better, they're timing their marketing, they're timing their whole sales push around these cycles of benchmarking and transparency laws, because they know that every time that building owners get a reminder of their upcoming benchmarking requirement, every time those building owners get a reminder that they haven't complied with those that haven't, that drives a big spike in sales calls and building owners calling up and looking for solutions. And so, it's a tangible example of the market moving power of even a benchmarking and transparency law, which is, of course, a pretty light touch as compared to a building performance standard. So we do see, real examples of market change on the ground in jurisdictions that have these policies. We also see some lessons learned, some policies that have, opportunities for improvement. And that's one of the reasons a number of jurisdictions that were working on building performance standards came to us and they said, we want help, can you write a sort of a model law for building performance standards? And we took all of the best elements of all the building performance standards that had already been adopted and some of the lessons learned, opportunities for improvement, and we put that into this model law, which is available for free download from our website. It's imt.org/BPS. And then we engaged with a number of stakeholders, with equity stakeholders, folks, community-based organizations, equity experts, with jurisdictions themselves that were implementing existing laws as well as developing new ones, and importantly with building owners and service providers to say, all right, how can we take into account real estate realities and create a law that doesn't just sound good, but will really make a difference on the ground and minimize unintended consequences. And for instance, we got 25 pages of comments on our model law, on our draft model law, on the Real Estate Roundtable, which is some of the biggest, that's just one of many, many groups that gave us feedback. But the biggest building owners recognize that this policy is going to be driving change across the many jurisdictions where they own buildings. And so, we had a really positive engagement, and it improved the draft, and it's a living document. It's constantly evolving to represent best practice. But recognizing that, commercial tenants are an important part of the problem, and they need to be an important part of the solution. Recognizing that affordable housing lacks capital, and you can't require affordable housing to make improvements without providing the resources to improve. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you don't want to exempt affordable housing because that's leaving the residents behind, leaving them out of the benefits of higher performing buildings. So there's a whole series of lessons learned from these laws around the country. Recognizing that you want to reward density, reward buildings that are operating long hours and getting a lot of production out of a limited footprint of building space. So a lot of these lessons learned are reflected in both our model law, and we've also recently published an implementation guide for how you implement building performance standards. And we're actually going to be doing a series of webinars starting on January 26th that go through best practices for implementing building performance standards, targeted mostly at governments that are in the position of implementing, but also very valuable for service providers and building owners that are operating in markets with building performance standards.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's such an important role you guys are playing. How can anyone listening to this sort of get involved? Can they join the coalition, or how does it work if people want to make sure that their voice is heard, or they want to play some role in pushing legislation forward? How does that work?
Sure. Well, if you're a government, we'd love for you to join the coalition. The main thing is that you're committing to put in place equitable building performance standards, working with your frontline communities, and you're going to have building performance standards or similar policies in place by Earth Day 2024. And again, that's nationalbpscoalition.org. There's a place to send an email saying, yes, we want to join the coalition. If you're a company, there are a variety of opportunities. If you're in the business of leasing or being a landlord, then encourage you, if you're not already, to look at the Green Lease Leaders program to get recognized for putting in win-win green leases. Also, we have governments that are directly supporting our work, trying to push legislation and other just sort of best practices around decarbonizing buildings and equitable decarbonization. And we have something we call the corporate Engagement Opportunity Program, CEO program. And that is a program for companies that want to keep current on these decarbonization policies, on these opportunities, and that want to support our work financially. And then there are a number of companies that we work with on an informal basis. Governments always respond to employers, and if a company is in the business of making buildings better, whether that's through innovative products or technologies or services, their voice is loud at the local level. And we've had a lot of success working with companies that say, look, I'm in the business of making buildings better. If you pass this law, it will create more demand for my services. I'll hire more people locally, create jobs for residents. That's a message that legislators want to hear, and we work with companies to deliver those messages.
I'd imagine there's a lot of those people listening to this episode, so I apologize if you get a lot of people reaching out to you, Cliff.
No, that's what I want. Send them my way.
Floodgates are open. Cliff's inbox. Well, thanks, Cliff, and thanks just in general to you and all your colleagues for this such an important work that's sort of upstream of a lot of our listeners' work is downstream of what you guys are doing to sort of make the actual progress happen before they get involved. So thank you. It's awesome. Let's end with some carve-outs. Any books, podcasts, documentaries, etc., that you have had a big impact on you lately?
I really enjoy sort of on the ground practitioner perspective. So I like the House Whisperers, sort of analysis of what decarbonization is going to look like at sort of ground level.
Okay.
And I enjoy listening to the Energy Gang podcasts, thinking about sort of the broader economy and the grid. And then just for a laugh, and I love Ted Lasso. I've been watching Ted Lasso. And trying to model some of my behavior on some of what he does.
Yeah, he's a model guy. I have a friend that reminds me of Ted Lasso, and it had been a long time since I had watched the show, and then I just kept ribbing him, and he's like, "You have to watch this," and he finally did, and he was like, "Yeah, now I understand why you wanted me to watch that," because he's like, it's like kind of like who he is already. Well, that's cool. I'll have to check out the House Whisperer because I feel like I need some sort of therapy around how hard it's been to get my house towards decarbonization. With the local supply chain where I'm at is kind of feels like pushing a boulder up a hill a little bit. So maybe there's some episodes that will help me sort of work through that process on the House Whisperer.
Yeah, I think we're going to see rapid change in that space. The Inflation Reduction Act, which passed last year, is going to create a ton of new business opportunities for heat pump installation and things like that. So unfortunately, though, there's going to be huge demand, and it may take a while for the workforce and the contractor community to catch up to that. Yeah.
And for those of you that are wondering, that are listening to this and heard me talk about my water heater like a year ago, it's still in the same place. Because of exactly what Cliff just said, I feel like I'm waiting for my local supply chain to sort of catch up with. I just hope that my water heater doesn't die. It's 18, 19 years old now. And I'm like, I really want a heat pump, but I need somebody to help me with it. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm in a holding pattern, essentially.
There was a really cool technology that actually was the winning technology at the Verge conference where we saw each other, called Harvest Thermal, which is pairing heat pumps and water heaters.
Oh, cool.
So that you can store hot water and potentially in the future cold water at off-peak times with low carbon electricity, and use that to heat your house at peak times.
Makes sense.
And also, of course, it's heating your house directly through the air at other times. So it's a great concept, and we need that kind of innovation, recognizing that the ways we used to do things doesn't work, but there's ways to win-win in terms of both for the climate and for lowering utility bills and for more comfortable spaces with innovative technologies.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you, Cliff, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, James. Great talking.
All right, friends, thanks for listening to this episode of the Nexus Podcast. For more episodes like this and to get the weekly Nexus newsletter, which, by the way, readers have said is the best way to stay up to date on the future of the smart buildings industry, please subscribe at nexuslabs.online. You can find the show notes for this conversation there as well. Have a great day.